So good morning, everyone. It is an enormous pleasure for us to be here today, and we are deeply grateful to Dr. Anthony Ping and the members of the Promotion Subcommittee of the Task Force to share with all of you part of the work that the Racial Geography Project has developed since it began 9 months ago. We are also thankful to the Race and Anti-Racism Research Fund and the Humanities Research Center who have supported our initiative. We are a research collective devoted to investigating histories of racism, violence, and resistance that are hidden in plain sight on the Rice University campus, from its land and buildings to its monuments and ornaments. Our final goal is to offer a cartography of the campus that recognizes its racial landscape through a series of site-specific interventions at strategic locations across the university. These interventions will be complemented by a digital diachronic campus map, a series of podcast episodes, ephemeral publications, and innovative forms of collaboration with local artists.
It's my pleasure to introduce the collective's members who, with Fabiola Lopez Duran and I, come from disciplines across the university, from applied math to English, from computer science to VADA. Their fearlessness when facing incredibly difficult topics and their belief in and dedication to the project is really inspiring. The undergraduates that are part of the collective are Amber Wang, Amy Lin, Anthony Wynn, Dalia Golka, Emily Weaver, Gabriella Foyet, Jared Snow, Lauren Ma, Mark Armenia, Morgan C., Sanviti Sadev, Soha Rizvi, Sporthi Kamapali, Sumin Huang, and Venus Alamanji. The PhD students are Cheney Hill, Giovanna Bassi, James McCabe, Karen Su, and Lynn Lee. You will hear from many of them directly as we share some of the key points we have learned about during our 9 months of investigation, which has been enriched by conversations with and research conducted by the chairs of the task force and their students, Dr. William Jones, and the members of the task force's research and teaching working group.
We are driven by the urgent need to reassess national and institutional treatments of historical and persistent racial injustice and anti-Black racism in the United States, and by discourses regarding the crucial role of counter-monuments and transitional justice. We were inspired by the work of the Settler Colonial City Project, a research collective organized by Professors Ana Maria Leon and Andrew Herscher at the University of Michigan, and by the Hallowed Grounds Project, Race, Slavery, and Memory at the University of Alabama, an alternate campus tour organized by Professor Hilary Green, informed by her own research and that of her students.
The collective is currently organized into 5 groups, which are listed on the screen. We have been able to identify over 120 events related to these 5 research fields. To familiarize you with them, Fabiola and I will share an example from each field, and then today's panelists will provide a deeper look through introducing some of their research. Let's begin with William Marsh Rice and slavery. This is the second page of a letter from William Marsh Rice to W.G. Rooker, Esquire, sent in May 1900, 4 months before Rice passed away. The letter concerns business. Rice briefly discusses acres of land, speculations, and shares his thoughts on the low price of cotton the year prior. It seems recalling the price of cotton in 1899 led him to recall a time before the abolition of slavery. Stringing his thoughts around the edges of the page, he reminisces about the better price of cotton in 1842 and the remarkably low cost of labor. He writes, quote, "Negro labor did not cost much, only to feed the Negroes and give them a coarse cotton suit which the Negroes made. In those days, raising Negroes was the most profitable," end quote. I don't read these dehumanizing words lightly. these words that disclose either a casual, profit-driven assessment of enslavement, or maybe even a wistfulness for the days of enslavement, for forcing the reproduction, the sexual relations, the pregnancies, the childbirth of enslaved people to increase profits. I chose to read them rather than to paraphrase, because they offer an indication of William Marsh Rice's consideration of enslaved labor decades after the Civil War and the emancipation of enslaved Africans in the US, indeed decades after the emancipation of those or the children and grandchildren of those Rice and his family enslaved.
Let's follow with our second research field titled Land, Architecture, and Labor. And let's focus on the celebratory relief that we can see at Lovett Hall of Francis Galton, the British scientist who coined the term eugenics and launched the biological and social movement that strove for nothing less than the improvement of the inborn qualities of a human race. Galton was not just one of the saints and seers of the Rice Institute, as Rice's first president, Edgar Odell Lovett, called the 16 pioneers carved on the capitals of the cloister's colonnade. Galton was the very representation of one of the four applied sciences that Lovett, in his 1912 inaugural speech, announced as fundamental to the Institute's curriculum. For Lovett, studies at Rice will be centered in, quote, the fundamental branches of pure science with a view to solutions of problems of applied science in four specific fields: engineering, economics, eugenics, and education itself, end quote.
The third research focus centers on William Marsh Rice's memorial in the academic quad. Collective members have looked into early discussions about memorializing Rice on campus, and this letter from 1923 unveils one of, we believe, the earliest conversations about it. As you can see, William Ward Watkin, one of the architects in charge of designing the first phase of the Rice campus, wrote to the then Rice president, Edgar Odell Lovett. In the letter, he would address Lovett's suggestion to build a house for the Institute's president himself that would also honor William Marsh Rice. Watkin recalls a prior conversation he had with Lovett in which they considered incorporating parts of William Marsh Rice's downtown Houston home, which you can see below, into the designs. Watkin emphasized that its stairway, some of its trimmings, doors, and millwork could be incorporated to make the president's house a founder's house. Watkin said, quote, if this were done, then you would be freer to consider the further memorial to the founder in connection with the residence or adjacent to the residence, end quote. In other words, the president's house, either physically itself through the reuse or replications of elements from Rice's former home, or through a memorial in, say, the president's private garden, would be the William Marsh Rice Memorial. However, it would not be until 1949 that a house for the Institute's president was built. Today, we know the house as Huff House.
Our fourth research field focuses on the multiple instances in which white supremacy has been overtly performed and celebrated at the Rice campus. This photo of what seems to be a group of 20 Rice students in Ku Klux Klan robes, hooded and bearing the Klan cross insignia, was taken by photographer A. Clocker, the author of many photos of the Second Klan in Houston and its many initiation ceremonies in the early 1920s in Texas. We were able to confirm the location of this photo. Many doubted it was actually taken at Rice. The location of this photo was the Field House, Rice's first athletic facility, a 1920 building designed by William Watkin and built in 1920 on the western edge of campus, across the BCR, where the Holloway Field is now located. The building was demolished in the mid-1950s.
It may feel like an abrupt jump from the prior topics to the final research focus we will share today, which centers on Black life at Rice, specifically for now, early Black life at Rice. Keep in mind, though, that when the first Black professors and students arrived, the legacies of what we just shared remained, sometimes even extremely overtly, as you'll see. These legacies still remain. The research group focusing on early Black life at Rice has been learning how to conduct oral histories, and pretty soon they'll be interviewing the first Black students and professors, which I should note they're able to do because the university desegregated relatively recently in the mid-1960s. On the screen, you can see photographs of the first Black undergraduate woman and man admitted to Rice, Jacqueline McCully and Charles Edward Freeman III. They integrated the university's undergraduate division in 1965. At the top of your screen is an article about Miss McCully, who is pictured standing at Lovett Hall in the academic quad and playing catch with her brother. Directly beneath, we can see Charles Freeman in the foreground of the photo at his graduation from Lincoln High School in Port Arthur, Texas, which was an all-Black school until it desegregated in 1965. The image is from his senior yearbook, which notes he graduated as co-salutatorian, received a scholarship to attend Rice, and graduated with additional awards. So now I'd like to welcome Cheney Hill and Soha Rizvi, who will begin the panel discussion.
Hello, so today, if you could go to the next slide, please. Today, I'm going to discuss Rice's involvement with businesses such as the firm of Rice and Nichols, William M. Rice and Company, the Houston Cotton Compress Company, the Buffalo Bayou Brazos and Colorado Railway, the Houston Direct Navigation Company, and Rice's role as creditor for plantation owners. Rice accumulated his wealth through these various business ventures, all of which are peripherally or directly implicated in the varying networks of trade that link the plantation of the South with the economies of the world. By 1839, Rice owned acreage in Harrisburg County and Houston. In these early years, Rice was heavily involved in the trading of a variety of goods ranging from plantation supplies to rope, clothing, and groceries, as you can see from these ads. His early business ventures as a merchant, shipper, and distributor in and around Houston foreshadow Rice's later involvement with the global cotton trade and his entanglement with slavery, which another member of our collective has researched. Next slide, please. Rice became intimately familiar with the cotton industry and by 1860 set up and registered the Houston Cotton Compress Company with the state. The Cotton Compress Company aimed to expand Houston's role in the global cotton markets, linking Southern plantations with other states and countries. To expand Houston's role in the global cotton market, Rice also registered the Buffalo Bayou Brazos and Colorado Railway, which aimed to make Harrisburg, which is currently located in Southeast Houston, a railway center and bring commerce to the region. Rice's impact on transportation networks extended beyond the development of railways to the development of Buffalo Bayou and Galveston Bay. He was deeply invested in developing the bayou and bay into a more traversable and universal system of transportation. The work done to make the bayou and bay more navigable led to Galveston being one of the preeminent ports in the region, bringing wealth to businessmen like William M. Rice. Next slide, please. Rice's networks of trade extended beyond Galveston and Houston. During the Civil War, the Union Navy set up blockades around Confederate harbors, Texas is included, which left cotton growers reliant on blockade runners for the export of crops. Eventually, traders and the Confederate government realized the only way to transport their goods was to export cotton over land to Mexico and then to ship it from Mexico to friendly ports in Cuba and the Bahamas. Rice took advantage of this change and shifted his focus away from the warehouses of Rice & Co. and towards the exportation of cotton to Matamoros, where cotton was sold or traded with Britain and merchants in the northeastern US. It is clear that even during the Civil War, the North and other international entities were peripherally complicit in the plantation economy of the South. Some sources state that Rice came out of the Civil War without suffering any financial losses, while others argued he came out more wealthy. Next slide, please. In part, this is because of his transshipping ventures, but is also due to the establishment of Houston as the manufacturing and distributing point of Texas, a designation that was enabled by Rice's business ventures and by the plantation economy, which gave rise to Houston as an economic and transportation powerhouse in the years to come, which can be seen by this printed engraving from the Texas World newspaper, which depicts Houston as the hub of manufacturing and distributing of Texas in 1898. Next slide, please. We do not yet have a complete picture of all the plantations that Rice did business with. However, we do know he did business with P.T. Wade of Fort Bend County. The above on the left is a reward ad for the return of an enslaved person to Wade. The fugitive slave ad shows that Tom was enslaved by Rice, who bought him about 2 years prior to running away. However, while Rice enslaved Tom, Wade set forth a $50 reward for his return. This shows the close business ties that Rice had with the plantation economy and slavery. We also have deed records showing Rice's involvement in other plantations. In 1849, the deed records of Brazoria County show that James Love of Oyster Creek Plantation, otherwise known as Chenango Plantation, contracted Rice, Adams & Co. to fund a sugar mill for Love to sell his crops through their company. According to these documents, Love mortgaged half interest on his land and enslaved people for funds to build a sugar mill and have operational funds. While William M. Rice and Charles W. Adams were the guarantors on this mortgage. While there are many gaps in the archive, we hope to continue researching Rice's business connections to plantations and plantation owners. And I will now pass it on. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Soha, and I'm going to talk about Rice's more personal engagement with slavery, as well as his engagements with the Confederacy during the Civil War. So on this slide, you can see we have a picture from a video from the Heritage Society that shows his house located on the corner of Congress Street and San Jacinto. And he lived there with his family from 1856 to 1863. It had been originally built for his business partner, Ebenezer B. Nichols, who we have discovered a lot about in our research, and he sold it to Rice. And this is also where the individuals that Rice claimed as property lived. And so you see the orange circle is where they might have lived, but we are not certain about that. But we do know from the Heritage Society that both the Nichols and Rice families were served in the house by slaves who lived in an outbuilding above or near a detached kitchen behind the home. And in that screenshot below, where it says the quarters were in the rear of Rice's residence those who lived in the quarters in the rear of Rice's residence were a nuisance. That is from the Daily Telegraph, and this is from the research of Andrew Forrest Muir, who collected a lot of the research about William Marsh Rice that we are using as a jumping off point for our research. And then on the left, you can see the 1860 slave census that details the ages of enslaved people that William Marsh Rice claimed ownership of. And so we have the names of some of those people because of the Harris County Deed Book, where we have transcribed some of the, engagements where William Marsh Rice would give ownership of some of the people he enslaved to other people. So for example, some of the names of the individuals that we found are Isham, who was mortgaged to James Mackenzie by James Mackenzie to William Marsh Rice and Charles Adams when he was 22 years old. John, who was in his early 20s in December 1845, and was purchased by William Marsh Rice and Ebenezer B. Nichols from Matt R. Evans. Ellen and Louisa, who you will see on the next slide, if you could go to the next slide. There is a screenshot of the Harris County Deed Book. And it says that William Marsh Rice, in consideration of the love and affection he has to said Frank Rice Nichols, which is his nephew, has granted and delivered possession, and does hereby donate and deliver possession to said Frank his heir, and assigns the half interest owned by him in and to a certain slave named Ellen, aged about 17 years and of light black color, and also and into her infant child named Louisa, aged about 1 year. So William Marsh Rice not only used the labor of enslaved people in his cotton companies, but, and we're not sure whether these enslaved people were working in his home or were used for his cotton labor, but we know for sure that there were people who were more personally closer to his life that he enslaved. And so, for example, that is an ad that he placed in the Weekly Telegraph for Marinda, who is almost 30 years old, dark complexion, slender built. He said, "She is probably lurking about town. I will pay a liberal reward for her apprehension and delivery to me." Next slide, please. So then we found some Weekly Telegraph meeting notes from municipal meetings that William Marsh Rice was a part of. Excuse me. So in the first one, you can see it says, "Resolved that the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency by Black Republican Party of the Northern States upon the principles of that party is the denial of the right of the Southern states to equality in the Union, reducing them to the condition of provinces, and forces upon them the vital issue of emancipation of slavery with all its evil consequences, or the withdrawal of the Southern states from the Confederacy." And William Rice signed on this, although it does say that there was one dissenting voice for the first resolution, so it is possible that that was William Marsh Rice. And then you can see just a month later, he signed on another sort of resolution saying, now abolitionism is the ascendant, and the exercise of its power imminent. So he was clearly expressing views against abolition and in support of slavery. Thank you. Next slide. And so then these are just really quickly came after that, where he gave money for the Bayou City Guard, which were Confederate troops, and then on that, which was on the right, and then on the left is more or less the same thing. So he was actively supporting the Confederacy during the Civil War. And that's all.
Thank you, Soha. So now we're going to and thank you, Cheney. We're going to hand the mic over to Giovanna Bassi, Mark Armenia, and Sanviti Saddev. I should also note that we are taking questions at the end of the panel discussion. And if you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will get to them later.
You can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. I'm Giovanna Bassi, and today I'm going to talk about the Rice Institute map of property claimed by George Herman from 1906, which was the point of departure to examine the history of our campus land in relation to the legacies of settler colonialism and racialization. Historical accounts of the establishment of our campus tend to represent the land as a mostly unpopulated wild prairie. By focusing on natural features such as the Harris Bayou and ignoring the existing traces of human occupation, these accounts preserve the modernist myth of the tabula rasa, the idea that nothing significant existed or happened in this place before construction of the campus began in 1910. This suspect mythology conceals a history of white supremacy, a colonialist history of racial oppression, dispossession, displacement, and exploitation. This map reproduces the myth of the tabula rasa. Although photographs of the early 1910s show that there were human-made structures such as sheds, barns, and cottages standing on campus grounds, the map represents the land as a blank slate ripe for development. The only reference to nature is that meandering line that represents the Harris Bayou. A series of abstract geometric lines stand for the boundaries of the land tracts that the Rice Board of Trustees began to purchase in 1908. These lines testify to the arbitrariness of the processes by which this land had been appropriated, demarcated, and contested. There were legal disputes already, a discrepancy between what George Herman claimed was his property boundary, the line sketched in a deed, and the location of a fence. Further disproving the foundational myth, the map documents the presence of the transportation infrastructures that made economic and urban development possible, as well as the ongoing processes of land speculation that would turn this part of the city into an exclusionary neighborhood. Next slide, please. Even more interesting, this map records the names of the previous owners of the campus land, George Herman, August Warneke, and others. I found the labels P.W. Rose League, Joss Gamble Survey, and Obedience Smith League intriguing. I found the terms survey and league refer to the land grants that the Republic of Texas offered in the 19th century to encourage Anglo immigration to the area, and that the names attached to them correspond to the grantees. Next slide, please. The largest concessions were called first-class head rights. They granted each head of family one league, or a unit of land area equivalent to 4,428 acres of grazing land, plus one labor, or 177 acres of irrigable farmland. Through these legal instruments, these Anglo settlers colonized the land and expropriated resources that the Karankawa people needed to live. The Karankawa were indigenous groups who established seasonal settlements in this section of the Texas Gulf Coast. They had managed to survive 300 years of Spanish occupation and disease, but they finally succumbed to the pressures of Anglo colonization and the war that the settlers waged against them. The Texas Constitution of 1836 guaranteed that no indigenous or Black people could own or live in this land in the future, effectively ensuring their marginalization and oppression. While stipulating that all citizens were entitled to land, the Constitution made clear that, quote, Africans, the descendants of Africans and Indians, end quote, could not be considered citizens. The establishment of Rice University would not have been possible without this unfair and cruel system of land distribution and occupation. William Marsh Rice was one of its beneficiaries. In 1839, he received a certificate for 320 acres in the city of Houston, which helped him to begin building his fortune. Our campus sits on 3 of these land grants. Given the short time, I will only speak about one of them. The majority of our campus, about 64%, sits on what used to be Pleasant Washington Rose's first-class head right. Rose was an ex-army surgeon who had worked in William Stafford's plantation, providing care to enslaved Black people. Aspiring to become a landowner himself, he traveled to Houston and appropriated land by the Braves by carving his name on a pine tree and growing corn and moving there with his family. When he died in 1839, his land was subdivided and his daughter Dilju and husband inherited Tract B, which is where our campus sits. They prospered there, building a farm and raising cattle. Next slide. The structures that you can see in the photographs probably used to belong to them. These were active participants in the process of settler colonialism, supported the slave economy and movers and endeavors of the Republic, and also probably fought against indigenous people. Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Sanviti, and I will be giving a brief overview of my research, which focuses on the people who work to build and maintain the physical campus of Rice University. So these are some news clippings about Rice's earliest buildings that reference the workers involved in its construction. The first talks about around 60 laborers at work on the administration building. The second is an article that appeared in the Houston Chronicle in 1912, titled 600 Men Toil to Finish $10 Million School in Time, and describes these toiling workers as sun-browned workmen, sun-tanned men, and an army of men with bronze skins. And while emphasizing the darker skin of the construction workers, it does decline to directly identify them as non-white, instead adopting the sort of euphemistic language to hint at it. Next slide, please. However, a large amount of photographs of the construction of Rice's buildings from the earliest days of the Institute until the end of the 1930s show that much of the physical labor was performed by Black and Hispanic men. These are just some of the photographs from the construction of the first few buildings. So Lovett Hall, or the administration building, in 1911, and the physics building in 1913 and 14 that unambiguously show the construction workers as Black men. Next slide, please. Further, all of the materials used in the campus buildings and for the roads, as well as fuel for the power plant, were brought in by the San Antonio and Aransas Pass Railway Spur, which was completed in 1913. And these are a series of photographs from 1914, which show Black men loading and unloading the fuel tanks for the spur. Next slide, please. It's significant that after archival research, I don't know most of the names of these workers. Apart from the photographic evidence, one of the few records that provides more details about them is this 1912 payroll timesheet for the construction of a cinder track for an athletic field where the track and soccer stadium is today. It can be deduced from their last names in the timesheet that most of these laborers were Hispanic, paid an average of 20 cents per hour, and they may have worked alongside the Black workers viewed in the photographs. Next slide, please. Some more evidence for the identities of the workers lies in records of Tony Martino's grounds crew, who was the main gardener at Rice at the time. In an interview with Ray Strange, daughter of the supervising architect William Ward Watkin, she recalls of Martino's crew that not many of them spoke English. Some of the workers lived in a densely wooded area along the now buried Harris Bayou, seen in the picture on the left. Referring to the, quote, noisome Harris Gully, which ran behind the old stadium, which is today the Lay Track and Hallway Field. Rice librarian Hardin Craig Jr. recalled in a 1966 letter, quote, how wild and overgrown that part of campus was when the old house and barn for the mule team was still there, end quote. And in the sketch, you can see the stable that was probably used to house the mules that we also saw at work in the previous photographs with the construction workers. And that concludes my brief overview of some of what we've collected about those who built the Rice campus. In the face of archival gaps, identifying their names and remembering their stories is an important step in recognizing that it was largely Black and Hispanic people who built this campus, despite their initial exclusion from participating in it, and further understanding the racial dynamics that underpinned its creation. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mark, and for the RGP, my research has led me to these huge tracts of land that Rice owns in southwestern Louisiana. Following the Civil War, this swath of land was a vast, undeveloped woodland, only populated by the Attakapas people and a few settlers. Starting in the 1850s and until his death in 1900, William Marsh Rice was a speculator for the region, telling his agents to search for, quote, first-class longleaf pine, unquote, and gobbling up land in what is now Beauregard and Allen parishes in Louisiana, indicated by the two maps on the right. Rice bought nearly 50,000 acres for only $1.25 per acre. Next slide, please. With the completion of a nearby railroad in 1906, the land finally became commercially viable. To manage the property, the Rice Institute Board of Trustees established the Rice Land Lumber Company in February 1911. The first action of Rice land, the sale of timber rights to the American Lumber Company, which had a mill in nearby Maryville, netting the Institute $3.7 million. By 1915, the once old growth forest became prairie land as the rice forest was clear cut, a standard procedure in that age. Reforestation was not a feasible option when logging operations began, but however, the Rice Institute had already extracted enough profit to finance the construction of the campus master plan and its early buildings, including Lovett Hall, Mechanical Laboratory, Hertzing Hall, and what would be Will Rice, Baker, and Hanson colleges as seen on the top right. Next slide, please. This was all happening during Louisiana's lumber boom, the days of giant trees, giant mills, giant lumbermen. There is no doubt that workers who toiled in the forest and the mills were heartlessly exploited, with employee unrest growing, reacting to meager wages, long workdays, and exploitative practices in company towns. The Brotherhood of Timber Workers formed in Western Louisiana, a union gaining nearly 50,000 members in its 2 years of existence. And notably, the union made significant efforts to have an integrated membership, with some reports claiming that nearly half the members were Black laborers. And the Brotherhood's main antagonist, the Southern Lumber Operators Association, or the SLOA. At the helm was Houstonian lumber and oil magnate John Henry Kirby, who was also pro-segregationist and manipulated racial tensions within the Brotherhood. A labor strike at Grabow, a nearby lumber town, resulted in 4 deaths and the arrest of 64 unionists, only 5 days before the Rice Institute's opening ceremony. All the while, the American Lumber Company mill in Maryville, which processed Rice's lumber, had become a central hub for the Brotherhood. Laborers there even successfully negotiated better working conditions for themselves. Following the Grabow massacre, unionists at the Maryville mill held a months-long strike. In response, the SLOA cracked down on the Brotherhood Union, reopening the mill with non-union laborers and bringing in company police who destroyed the union's headquarters, attacked Brotherhood members, and managed to permanently stamp them out. It is currently unknown whether Rice trustees were aware of the labor situation on the Institute's Louisiana property, though there is much to be said of the adversities and maltreatment laborers faced while working on Rice property, whether in Houston or southwestern Louisiana. Next slide, please. In later years, renewed activity on the Louisiana land came on the heels of the rapid industrial mobilization and militarization across the US during World War II. Meanwhile, advancements in technology and the tax code changes made reforestation not only viable, but also desirable. To this day, Rice land continues the same plan of pine tree crop rotation that it had started after World War II. Next slide, please. Unbeknownst to William Marsh Rice and the Institute trustees was the so-called black gold sitting thousands of feet below the surface, the Neal oil field. Nearly 95% of the reservoir, discovered in 1941, is underneath the property, allowing for Rice land to claim a hefty profit on drilling rights. And a 1988 Rice Thresher article boasts that the newfound oil and timber prospects had boosted the endowment by tens of millions of dollars throughout the years. These developments helped fund the Institute's post-World War II construction plan, which involved Fondren Library, Rice Stadium, numerous academic halls, and several new college buildings and wings, as seen on the right. Ultimately, the university's ties to industries relying on extraction were always entrenched in its existence. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanna, Mark, and Sanviti. Next, we have James McCabe, who will be presenting on the William Marsh Rice Memorial.
Thank you. So for my presentation, I will be discussing the memorial commemoration and unveiling ceremony that happened at the 15th commencement, before the 15th commencement ceremony at Rice University. Next slide, please. My main focus will be on looking at some of the brief biographies of the different people who were attending. In this image here, taken at the event at 8:30 a.m., this shows kind of the setup of it, the different people. So there are 4 students who were involved in the unveiling ceremony, chosen specifically for their connections and their investment within the undergraduate community at the Rice Institute. They were William Standish, who was from the class of 1916, the first graduating class, and would later become the president of the Alumni Student Association in the 1930s. Another student, Frances Vesey and Lillian Horlock, who later became Lillian Illig, were both from the graduating class of 1930 and were big workers within the Student Association and the Women's Club, invested in newspaper and other such events. And finally, there was Lily Rice, who was the graduating class of 1932, and she was part of the women's literary societies at the time and was a grandniece of William Marsh Rice, the founder. Next slide, please. Along with these various students, they had 3 speakers giving different orations over the ceremony. The first was President Edgar Odell Lovett, who gave a brief overview of the Rice Memorial statue, paying tribute to John Angel, the British sculptor who came and did the work, as well as laying out some of the other people, such as William Ward Watkin, Ralph Adams Cram, and others, and also paying tribute to Arthur P. Cohn, who would put the ashes of William Marsh Rice a few weeks earlier. The next speech given by the nephew of William Marsh Rice, William Marsh Rice Jr., speech given by his brother Benjamin Rice, both of which were on the committee. And this basically lays out a way in which the founder is thought of as a donor, as a benevolent figure, giving his lineage to the Anglo-American revolutionaries, such as the family involvement with the Battle of Bunker Hill, and looking in ways in which they can portray their uncle as a great benefactor, and that his gift is knowledge and the university, the institute, to these students. The final speech given by Ralph Adams Cram, who also built and designed the memorial pedestal in which the statue resides on, praises John Angel and his work on the sculpture, saying that, quote, put into this visible form of high ideal of William Marsh Rice, here in this counterfeit presentment that is a supreme personification of the man himself. Echoing the other speakers, Cram explains that the memorial is, quote, a most noble presentation of its founder, as well as, quote, a noble demonstration of sculptural art that can well serve as a model and an inspiration for the future. Next slide, please. After this ceremony, it was published in various newspapers within the Houston area, discussing the events of the statue, as well as noting that it is the largest class graduating from Rice Institute to date. So thank you very much.
Thank you, James. We're now going to go to the group researching overt displays of white supremacy on campus. We're going to start with Morgan C. and then move on to Sumin Huang. Morgan, this is your first. Yeah, okay.
Yes. Hello, my name is Morgan, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the Mayfete. So the Mayfete is a celebration that first started within the city of Houston, and then 2 years after that celebration, it began at Rice University. So the Mayfete began at Rice in the year 1921, and it continued annually for a 20-year period. So the Mayfete was a celebration that included maypole dancing, various athletic events, dramatic events, and the crowning of a Mayfete queen. So I firstly just want to talk very briefly about the first Mayfete occurring in 1921, because it really sets the precedent for colonial nostalgia within the celebration at Rice. So the first Mayfete hosted a theatrical pageant that depicted the Old South, as it was referred to in Thresher articles, that pageant goers wanted to create. So this pageant was a 4-episode pageant based off of the poem Texas, a Democratic Ode, which was also presented at Rice's inauguration, at the inaugural address for Rice. And so this 4-episode pageant, it's romantically described in the Thresher as a time when immigrants come and go, when the states welcome the lovely daughters of the South into their confederation. It also describes the Civil War as a time where brother fought against brother and ended, in closing, referring to a nobler race of men and women, which we can allude to and understanding that it's referring to those of the white race. So this was the first Mayfete, and now I specifically would like to focus on the 1930 Mayfete. So you can go to the next slide, Adrian. Thank you so much. And so the 1930 Mayfete is significant for several reasons. I do want to preface this by saying that the 1930 Mayfete, just a month after this, was when we saw the erection of the William Marsh Rice's statue in the Central Quad. So this Mayfete was particularly important because, one, it was the second most attended Mayfete in the history of this event. So over 3,500 guests were in attendance, and these were guests not only from the university, but also from the wider Houston community. And so this event specifically was even more interesting because of the setting in which it took place. So this event was centered around a plantation home as the backdrop for this event. And while I was unable to find a picture depicting that set, I've gone through multiple Thresher articles throughout my research to give a good description of what this plantation home may have looked like. I would also like to say that the plantation home, setting the backdrop for this May Fête, was designed and constructed by the Architecture Society, the architectural students here there at Rice at the time. So as you can see from these Thresher articles, the old plantation home is described to be red brick with a red brick massively pillared mansion. It has artificial grass and palm trees. It has a grassy bower of green oak trees with gray patches and Spanish moss. So from the description of this plantation home, it is described to be very big and extravagant. Also in my research, there were multiple Thresher articles leading up to the day of the event that really anticipated this set and anticipated seeing this plantation home. In addition to this, so these articles that I have on the screen are from the Houston Post, the May 4th edition in 1930. But I also have a quote that describes, or I also have a part of this passage that describes a student dressed as, it uses a racial slur, but it is essentially a caricature of a Black child. So a student that attended Rice and was attending this event dressed as this caricature and essentially is described as a court jester, is what they are compared to. And so not only do we see this old plantation home backdrop, but we have the explicit exploitation of this idea of Blackness as a form of entertainment for the attendees. So lastly, I wanted to touch on one other event, next slide please, that just to kind of emphasize that this colonial nostalgia did not end with the May Fête when it ended in 1941. So the Hansen Minstrel Gala occurred for 4 years, beginning in 1960. So it ran from 1960 to 1964, and it started as a homecoming weekend event. And it was described by the Thresher as having ebony shaded jokes. Students, a Black minstrel choir also performed, or Black-faced choral group, as it was described in the Thresher. So Blackface was present, very offensive jokes were made, and it came to an end in 1964, and it was described to come to that close as a result of the race issue. So again, we see multiple instances of colonial nostalgia and explicitly racist events that were occurring on campus. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Sumin, and today I'll be presenting my research surrounding the relationship between William Marsh Rice, Rice Institute, and the legacies of the American Confederacy. William Marsh Rice's active participation in the slave economy, which was discussed earlier by Cheney and Soha, sets the tone for Rice's relationship with the Confederacy's sociopolitical legacy. In his book, William Marsh Rice and His Institute, Andrew Forrest Muir claims that Rice, a New England-born, Texas-based cotton distributor, was a unionist during the American Civil War. However, records from Rice's transactions from this time period similarly demonstrate his greater commitment to capital over the union's goals and objectives. Furthermore, ledgers from 1861 reveal that Rice donated around $17,000 to the Confederate States of America to finance the salaries of Confederate military officers. And while Rice did not apparently actively invest in Confederate stock or currency during the Civil War, an 1898 testimony from Rice reveals he did borrow and use Confederate bills to pay outstanding debts whenever profitable. On the left image here, we can also see a brief description of a celebration of the Confederate flag that occurred in an early commencement ceremony at Rice Institute, which sets a context for campus-wide attitudes toward the Confederacy. Next slide, please. Building upon this relationship with the Confederacy, post-Civil War ephemeral memorabilia from William Marsh Rice documents a prominent social event from 1895 United Confederate Veterans Reunion that occurred at the Capitol Hotel, an institution referred to as the Rice Building and a forerunner of the Rice Hotel. The reunion was attended by thousands of young men, and its souvenir album states that they could have nowhere seen, quote, brighter exemplars of the highest type of manhood, unquote. On May 23rd, Rice himself participated in a city-wide flower parade as a part of the 1895 reunion. The May 24th, 1985 edition of the Houston Daily News reveals that Rice led in a float with Farina Winnie Davis, the last daughter of Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy and known idol among the daughters of the Confederacy. Next slide, please. Given Rice's involvement with not only the Confederacy, but also the United Confederate Veterans specifically, it is not surprising that the institute, founded in his name 12 years after his death, participated in the Houston-wide celebration of the Confederate Memorial Weekend that occurred from October 5th to 8th, 1920. A front page headline of the institute's newspaper, The Thresher, read, quote, "A holiday set for Confederate Day, veterans to be welcomed on academic court at Rice Friday," end quote. This article describes how Rice Institute honored the visiting Confederate veterans as venerable and respected guests with programs and receptions on campus. The Houston Post reports that Rice Institute hosted an open reception for K.M. Van Zandt, the then Commander-in-Chief of the United Confederate Veterans, on the Friday of the Memorial Weekend, as well as a tea ceremony for the wives of the Confederate veterans. Recalling the 1895 celebrations, the weekend ultimately concluded with an elaborate parade in downtown Houston, starting at the Sabine Street Bridge and traveling down Main Street. The Houston chapter of the Ku Klux Klan, San Houston No. 1, made their first public appearance in this parade. According to multiple accounts, the Klansmen mounted on horseback carried a banner reading, quote, "We were here yesterday, 1866. We are here today, 1920. We will be here forever," end quote. The Houston Post also reveals that Rice students participated in a subsequent series of parades during the weekend, such as the Houston Rice Rooters Club, a student organization formed to cheer on Rice athletics at their games. Although it is still unclear why this club chose to or was chosen to participate in the parade, coverage in the Thresher reveals legacies of the Confederacy and subsequent histories of racism in Rice's athletic programming. Rice sporting events throughout the first half of the 20th century also heavily featured racist forms of entertainment, including blackface performers and Klan-themed drama performances during their halftime shows. These associations with both the Confederacy and the KKK would ultimately set the stage for the formation of Rice's own Klan chapter, the Ku Klux, as seen in the 1922 Campanile. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumin and Morgan. We're going to move along to the group researching Black life at Rice, beginning with Lynn Lee and ending with, last but not least, with Venus Alamanji.
Hello. So the topic of our research unit, Black Life at Rice, is deeply connected to the history of segregation and white supremacy at Rice. Based on the presentation that we've been seeing so far, we can understand how challenging life was for the first Black students who were admitted to the university after its official desegregation in 1964. My research looks at the founding of the BSU, the Black Students Union at Rice, and its activism during the first 2 decades of its existence. The story of Black students at Rice begins with the admission of the first African-American student, Raymond Johnson, currently Professor Emeritus at the University of Maryland and Adjunct Professor of Mathematics at Rice, who came as a PhD student in mathematics, but had to spend 1 year as a research assistant when 2 alumni sued the university against desegregation. And a few years later, in the early 1970s, the Black Students Union was created by a group of Black students at Rice whose objective was, according to the BSU Constitution, to help establish a total understanding of Black subculture and to enhance the social and intellectual participation of the Black students in the university and the community. One of the first initiatives of the BSU was to distribute pamphlets, as you can see on this slide, informing the academic community of the presence of Black students on campus and sharing their experience as a minority group and stating the goals of the union. It opens with the question, what is life like for a Black student attending Rice University? And reveals the difficulty of campus life for them who had to deal with social and cultural challenges on top of academic ones. Next slide, please. After its official creation, one of the first challenges that the BSU faced was to find a safe physical space on campus for members to gather and administer the union's activities. On March 16, 1972, Curtis Davis, a sophomore in the School of Architecture, who was also the BSU chairman at the time, submitted a proposal to President Hackeman to house the BSU Center in the former Naval ROTC building, located behind the Mechanical Engineering building and designed by William Mordwykin. He asked the administration to rescind the order to raise the building and allow its transformation into the BSU headquarters, which would include an information center, a library, a theater, a Black Arts center, and a classroom to teach courses in Black culture. However, the university ultimately turned down his request and replaced the building with physical plant facilities. As a result, the first BSU center seems to have been located in an old shack by the track stadium, which they shared with the athletic and fine arts department and was in need of repair. The BSU asked the Senate for financial support to renovate the shack, but they were only granted 15% of the requested amount. Although I don't know how long they had to use this cabin for, we know that by 1980, the BSU's office was housed on the second floor of the Rice Memorial Center. Next, please. Since its creation, the BSU was dedicated to diversify the academic community at Rice by encouraging Black high school students to come to Rice and demanding faculty integration. The picture on the left, taken in 1972, shows a group of Black students picketing outside a basketball game on campus, holding posters that read, "One whole Black professor, give us another token, please," and "Integration with segregation brings about demonstration." And 5 years later, a group of graduating seniors, including members of the BSU, published a letter to the editor requesting the hiring of more Black professors at Rice. And at the time, there were only 3 Black professors, including one who was expected to leave the following semester. The BSU also strived to bring more Black students to Rice by sending welcome letters to recently admitted Black high school students. Next slide, please. Such as the one that you can see on the left, in which BSU President Carl Thomas greets Renita King and informs her that there are about 131 Black students at Rice and that the BSU is present on campus and is organizing various activities. And it's very fortunate that King actually ended up attending Rice and graduated in 1984. In line with these efforts, in 1986, BSU co-president Alexander Bird, who is currently Associate Professor of History at Rice, Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and co-chair of the task force, launched the Operation Success, which was a volunteer tutorial program aimed at bringing more students to Rice from Yates High School, from which he himself graduated. He was awarded the National School Volunteer Program for this successful initiative in 1989. Next, please. In the process of doing research on the history of the BSU, I was particularly impressed by the dynamism of the union in its early years, despite the limited financial support that it got from the university. With the fund that they raised themselves through beer raffles, car washes, and spaghetti dinners, the BSU organized numerous events on campus, which were all free and open to the public, in order to celebrate Black culture in a predominantly white environment. Since 1972, the BSU organized annual celebrations of Martin Luther King Jr. Day through performances, concerts, arts exhibitions, and panel discussions. And it also celebrated Black History Week and Black History Month, inviting nationally renowned artists such as Arthur Mitchell, founder of the Dance Theater of Harlem, to perform on campus.
Venus, you're still muted.
Sorry about that. So Linus just talked about some of the experiences of early Black students at Rice. To get a fuller sense of Black lives at Rice, we also need to look at the experiences of Black faculty and staff. So today I'm going to be speaking about 2 of the earliest Black women professors at Rice, Professor Rose Mary Brewer with the longer hair, who began teaching here in 1974, and Professor Beverly Harris Shentz, who came in 1979. So these women come to Rice with few Black students and faculty. At the time, most Black members of the community were employees in the kitchen. Rice also had few women professors during this time. So these women are coming into a space where they are minorities in race and gender. And I think it's important to note the specificity because there can be a tendency to speak about race and gender as separate, which doesn't make room for the experiences of Black women. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Professor Brewer was an assistant visiting professor of sociology. She taught at Rice from 1974 to 1977. A Sallyport article notes when she first got here that she had study interests in social change and mobility, the Black community, and social stratification, to name a few. When you consider that a Rice education can lead to social change and mobility, and that the Black community here, at least on the faculty and student side, was in its infancy, her topics of study were particularly salient for the times. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any documents that track how she related with Black students or the Black Student Union, though. Next slide, please. Okay, so Professor Beverly Harris Shentz was an assistant professor of German. She was a resident associate at Baker College. During her time at Rice, she was the only Black professor here, which makes me very curious about her experiences. We get a sense of some of her views on Rice in a Thresher article written in 1980. And this article discusses Rice's admission process and concerns that Rice has poor recruitment and admit rates for students of color, especially Black students. Of the 2,800 students that applied that year, only 46 were Black. And this is concerning because it leads to a Rice lacking in diversity. And so the author talks to Professor Shentz, who begins by saying she often talks to students at Rice about diversity. In her own words, quote, "Many of these students say that they thought Rice was the most diverse environment they could live in. From my vantage point, that seems extremely naive. I don't think it's diverse at all. On the contrary, I think it's one of the most homogeneous environments I've ever been a part of." She goes on, and you can read along on the screen, the red. "From a very self-serving point of view, I personally feel that Rice students are being undereducated by virtue of the fact that they're being educated in a void." This is a remarkable statement, particularly coming from a faculty member. As Lynn just showed, Black students were protesting about the need for more Black faculty, more Black students. And sometimes, students' protest then and now can be dismissed as overly idealistic. So it's notable when a professor, someone seen as a source of authority, echoes these students by saying Rice is lacking in diversity. When Professor Shentz left in 1980, a Thresher article noted that with her departure, Rice was left with no Black faculty, and the author criticizes Rice and urges the school to go beyond its present hiring policies and actively seek out new Black faculty. We've seen that the experiences and views of early Black students and faculty at Rice contradicts the generally rosy views of Rice, just as I imagine our talk today has contradicted popular views of Rice's history and culture. That's it for me.
Thank you, Lynn and Venus. And thank you everyone else for your powerful presentations. To briefly close before we open up for a Q&A session, we'd like to say that as the collective ages, we plan on expanding and multiplying the research areas depending on research leads and the interests of members of the collective. When we began thinking about this project, we came up with about 40 topics, and you've seen 5 today, many of which we hope to delve into as we work to reconfigure the metrics for accomplishment embedded in our geography.
And I would like to say that this is an open-ended and crowd-sourced project, enriched by the diversity from background to disciplinary focus of its members. And it is our hope that addressing the university's relationship to slavery, segregation, and racial injustice openly, indeed physically, will encourage honest discourse about the ways in which such relationships continue to impact Rice today. Ultimately, we hope this project will contribute to the process of building a more affirmative university for students, faculty, and staff of all backgrounds.